Misty Island Rescue. It was an exciting day on the island of Sodor. The building work was nearly finished on the new search and rescue center. There would be a new helipad for Harold, and Rocky was getting his own shed, but there was still some work to do. It will be made of the strongest wood of all, Joby wood, the Fat Controller told Thomas and the other engines. The wood will arrive today at Brendam Docks. The most useful engine at the end of the day will get to pull the Joby logs to the search and rescue center. Thomas went quickly to work. Diesel wanted to show off, so he shunted all the Joby wood away from the docks. Stop! Thomas puffed, his boiler bubbling. Diesel only went faster and faster. Unfortunately, the flatbeds holding the wood jumped off the track and pulled Diesel towards the edge of a broken bridge. Thomas pulled Diesel back to safety, but all the wood fell into the sea. The Fat Controller was very pleased with Thomas. As a reward, Thomas would visit the mainland and bring back more Joby wood. The next day, as Thomas waited to be loaded onto a ship, Salty told him and Percy about Misty Island. Once, an engine was lost there. No one could find him because of the mist, Salty huffed. If I were lost on Misty Island, Thomas peeped, I'd puff 3 times. The dock manager told Thomas that there was no room for him on the ship. But Thomas had spotted a raft. The ship can pull me on that, Thomas puffed. Percy was worried that the raft wasn't safe. Don't worry, the Fat Controller said I'd make the right decisions, assured Thomas. And with that, the ship set off, pulling Thomas on a raft. When Thomas was far out at sea, and darkness started to fall, he heard a creak. The chain to the boat had snapped! Thomas whistled and wheezed as the big boat steamed away, but no one could hear him. The waves carried Thomas into the misty night. The next morning, Thomas found himself on a strange island. It was quiet and misty. As Thomas explored, he heard strange sounds. Rusty wheels rattled on old rails, and wild whistles echoed all around him. Thomas called out, but no one answered. Then, as he rounded a bend, he made an amazing discovery. Thomas had come fender to fender with 3 of the strangest engines he'd ever seen. Cinders and ashes, said Thomas. Who are you? The strange engines' names were Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand. They told Thomas that he was on Misty Island. We're the logging locos, said Dash. We've been watching you since you first rolled onto the island. We played rattling reels and whistling whistles with you, Bash said. But you didn't play with us. You can now if you want. Thomas didn't want to play with Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand. He thought their games were strange. No thank you. I have to get back to the island of Sodor. And with that, Thomas wheeled backwards down the track. Later, as the mist grew thicker and darkness fell, Thomas wasn't feeling so brave. He had chuffed and huffed all day, but he hadn't found a way off Misty Island. Thomas knew he would have to ask the logging locos for help. The next morning, on Sodor, the Fat Controller learned that Thomas was missing. Everyone wanted to help find Thomas. The engine searched all over Sodor. Harold took to the air. The Fat Controller and Captain went out to sea. Thomas spent the day looking for the logging locos. Tracks crissed and crossed. They climbed into foggy mountains and wheeled through tangled forests. Then, overlooking a deep valley, Thomas discovered an old logging camp. Footplates and fenders, Thomas exclaimed. I found the logging locos. Bash, Dash, and Ferdinand were loading wood in the old logging camp. Thomas asked them for help, but they were busy. We said hello to you yesterday, Dash said, but you didn't want to be friends with us." "I'm sorry," Thomas peeped. I was silly to think I could find a way off Misty Island by myself." Then Thomas realized something amazing. Bumpers and buffers! These logs are Joby logs. That's the wood we need to build the search and rescue center. The logging locos clanked closer together to listen as Thomas told them about the rescue center. They agreed to help him collect logs. Thomas showed the locos how quickly he could shunt flatbeds. One biff, one bash, and there's never a crash. "We can't work this hard," said Dash. "We'll run out of oil," said Bash. "That's right," added Ferdinand. The logging locos weren't diesels, but they used wood and oil for fuel. "I'm sure you have enough oil," Thomas said. "The Fat Controller says I make good decisions." The engines hauled logs and shunted flatbeds. But when they came to an old bridge, Thomas stopped. The logging locos liked bouncing on the wobbly, shaky bridge. "Yippee!" they cheered as they chugged across. Thomas didn't like the bridge, but he knew he had to cross it to collect the Joby wood. So he crept slowly across. Everything shook, but nothing broke. And Thomas was proud of himself for being so bold and brave. Thomas needed to load the logs onto flatbeds, but old Wheezy, the camp's giant log loader, wasn't much help. He jiggled and joggled, and logs flew here and there. They splashed in a pond and crashed into trees. The locos cackled with laughter. Thomas needed a better way to load the Joby wood. Luckily, he spotted an old machine. "That's Hee-Haw," said Dash. He's the old log loading machine." "He needs too much oil," Bash added. "That's why we don't use him." Thomas wasn't worried. They poured the last of the oil into Hee-Haw, and he creaked into action. Thomas was very pleased. Soon, Thomas had 3 flatbeds full of Joby logs, but he had no idea how to get them back to Sodor. "We could use the tunnel," Dash suggested. Thomas was amazed. "You didn't tell me there was a tunnel to Sodor," he peeped. "That's because it's dangerous," Dash said. Thomas was too excited to listen. "I know all about tunnels. It won't be dangerous." The engines wheezed and wheeshed into the old tunnel. Dash stopped at the entrance. "We locals don't have enough oil to puff to Sodor," he said. "Of course you do," puffed Thomas as he pushed his flatbed into the tunnel. "It's just a whir and a whiff, and we'll be there." They all disappeared into the dark and twisty tunnel. Suddenly, there was trouble ahead. The tracks were blocked by rocks. Then with a rumble and a crash, more rocks smashed down behind them. "We can push the rocks out of the way," Thomas puffed. Bash, Dash and Ferdinand bravely pumped their pistons, but with a gasp and a groan, they ran out of oil. They couldn't push any more. The engines were stuck in the tunnel, and no one knew where they were. Just then, Ferdinand noticed something. "I feel air in my funnel," he peeped. Dash spotted a hole in the roof of the tunnel. "Puff forward, Thomas, and huff your hardest," Bash suggested. "Someone will see your steam." Thomas excitedly beamed from buffer to buffer and started to puff. Back at Brendan Docks, Percy saw something that made his firebox fizz. 3 puffs of steam floated high in the distance. "It's Thomas," Percy peeped. "He's on Misty Island, and he needs help." Percy told the Fat Controller and all the engines about Thomas. Everyone was ready to help. "James, Gordon, and Edward, you will sail to Misty Island with me," said the Fat Controller. Then Whiff suggested using the abandoned tunnel that led to Misty Island. "It would be the fastest way to reach Thomas." "Won't that be dark and dangerous?" asked the Fat Controller. "Don't worry," puffed Whiff. "I know all the tracks." Meanwhile, Thomas and the logging locos were waiting in the dark tunnel. Soon, they heard a noise coming through the rocks. It was the clickety-clack of wheels on the tracks. Then, Thomas recognized Percy's friendly voice. "With I have found you, Thomas!" peeped Percy. "Watch out, Thomas!" Whiff puffed. "Percy and I are going to push through the rocks to reach you." With that, Percy and Whiff rocked and rolled backwards together. Then they pumped their pistons and crashed through the rocks. "Hooray for Percy!" puffed Thomas. "Hooray for Whiff!" Thomas introduced Whiff and Percy to the logging locos. With a shove and a shunt, Whiff pulled the brave engines out of the tunnel. The logging locos wheeshed and whooshed with wonder when they saw the sunny island of Sodor. Thomas helped the logging locos to the Sodor steamworks for repairs. He knew that Kevin and Victor would make them as good as new. The Fat Controller was excited to see that Thomas was safe. And with that all the Joby wood Thomas had found on Misty Island, the rescue centre would be finished in no time. Finally, the big day arrived. The Sodor Search and Rescue Centre and the Misty Island Tunnel were officially opened. "Today is a very special day, made possible by very special engines," the Fat Controller said as he cut a red ribbon with a giant pair of scissors. The people cheered and the engines peeped, Thomas, surrounded by his old and new friends, beamed with pride.